An oil tanker fleeing across the Atlantic Ocean, helicopters descending in the pre-dawn darkness, Russian flags hastily painted on a ship's hull, and a military operation that just sent shockwaves through the halls of power in Moscow, Beijing, and Washington. Welcome to Vantage, I'm Palki Sharma, and today we're diving into one of the most dramatic maritime seizures in recent memory. On Wednesday, January 8, 2026, United States Coast Guard and military forces seized a Russian-flagged oil tanker in the North Atlantic near Iceland. The vessel's name was Marinera, but that wasn't always its name. Just weeks earlier, it was called the Bella One. This 333-meter-long giant, capable of carrying 318,518 tons of oil, had been running from American authorities for more than 2 weeks. The ship was built back in 2002, making it 24 years old, exactly the kind of aging vessel that forms the backbone of what experts call the shadow fleet. And this wasn't just any chase. This was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse that stretched across thousands of miles of open ocean, involved Russian submarines, and culminated in a helicopter assault that looks like something straight out of an action film. Let's rewind to understand how we got here. In mid-December 2025, the Bella One attempted to dock in Venezuela to load sanctioned oil, but the United States had imposed stricter enforcement around Venezuelan waters, essentially creating a blockade. When the Coast Guard moved to intercept the tanker near Venezuela in late December, the Bella One refused to stop. Instead, the crew turned the massive ship around and fled north into the Atlantic. For the next 2 weeks, American P-8 surveillance aircraft tracked every movement. The tanker was heading northeast, skirting wide around Ireland, apparently making for Murmansk, a Russian port in the Arctic Circle. Marine tracking experts watched in real time as the vessel changed course, always staying just out of reach. But here's where it gets really interesting. Halfway through its escape attempt, something dramatic happened. The crew of the Bella One painted a massive Russian flag on the side of the hull. They changed the ship's name to Marinera, and on December 24, 2025, they re-registered the vessel under the Russian flag, listing Sochi, Russia, as its home port. This wasn't just a cosmetic change. Under international maritime law, a ship is essentially floating territory of whichever country's flag it flies. By becoming a Russian vessel, the Marinera was now theoretically under Moscow's protection, and Russia took that seriously. According to multiple reports, Russian naval assets were deployed to shadow the tanker, possibly including a submarine. Moscow even filed a diplomatic request with Washington, demanding that the United States stop pursuing what was now officially a Russian ship. But President Donald Trump had other plans. His administration had made it crystal clear that sanctioned oil tankers would not be allowed to operate freely, regardless of which flag they were flying. On that Wednesday morning, in the pre-dawn hours, the operation began. United States Coast Guard tactical teams, supported by the Department of Defense, launched from bases in the United Kingdom. Black Hawk helicopters lifted off into the darkness. The target was the Marinera, now in international waters between Iceland and Scotland. Footage from the raid shows helicopters approaching the massive tanker, thermal imaging revealing the exhaust from the engines. Assaulters in heavy tactical gear, night vision goggles mounted on their helmets, weapons at the ready, fast roped down onto the deck. Within minutes, the ship was under American control. The entire operation was executed with precision. No shots were fired, no casualties reported, but the message was loud and clear. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem announced the seizure hours later, revealing that 2 tankers had actually been taken that morning. The second vessel, the MT Sophia, was seized in the Caribbean Sea. Noem praised the heroic crew of the USCGC Monroe, the Coast Guard cutter that had pursued the Bella One across the Atlantic through what she called treacherous storms. She said the Marinera had been trying to evade capture for weeks, changing its flag and painting a new name on the hull in a desperate and failed attempt to escape justice. The Russian Transport Ministry immediately condemned the seizure, saying the ship had been granted temporary authorization to sail under the Russian flag in late December, and that they lost all communication with the vessel after US forces boarded it. Moscow demanded the prompt return of Russian citizens on board and insisted that the operation violated the principle of freedom of navigation on the high seas. The Russian Foreign Ministry told state media TASS that it was closely monitoring the situation. But why all this drama over an empty tanker? Because the Marinera wasn't carrying any oil when it was seized. The ship was empty. So what's really going on here? This is where we need to talk about the shadow fleet, one of the most important and least understood aspects of modern geopolitical competition. After Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Western nations imposed unprecedented sanctions on Moscow. The European Union, the G7, the United States and their allies essentially cut Russia off from the global shipping system. Western tankers wouldn't carry Russian oil. Western insurance companies wouldn't insure it. On paper, these sanctions should have crippled Russian oil exports, but they didn't. Instead, Russia did something clever. They built a shadow fleet. These are old tankers, typically 15 to 20 years old or even older, purchased at the end of their commercial lives. They have no clear owners. They're registered under flags of convenience like Panama, Liberia, Gabon or the Cook Islands, and they often have no proper insurance. According to data from the Kyiv School of Economics, by late 2023, this shadow fleet had grown to between 100 and 1,400 vessels. By mid-2025, estimates from S&P Global put the number at 978 tankers with a combined capacity of 127 million deadweight tons, representing about 18.5% of the entire global oil tanker fleet. Just let that sink in. Nearly 1 out of every 5 oil tankers on the ocean today is part of this shadow system. And it's not just Russian. Iran controls roughly 170 ships totaling 34.2 million deadweight tons. Venezuela has dedicated 54 tankers with 9.5 million deadweight tons to moving sanctioned oil. Another 193 vessels with 33 million deadweight tons are used by multiple sanctioned countries. The Bella one, now Marinera, was exactly this type of vessel. It had changed names 7 times since 2002. Its ownership structure was opaque, and it was on the US sanctions list since June 2024 for transporting sanctioned oil. These ships use sophisticated tactics to avoid detection. They turn off their AIS transponders, the automatic identification system that broadcasts a ship's location, making them invisible to tracking systems. They conduct ship-to-ship transfers in the middle of the ocean, moving oil from one vessel to another to hide its origin. They constantly change flags and names. They sail through European waters several times a day, carrying Russian, Iranian and Venezuelan oil to buyers in China, India, Turkey and elsewhere. According to the Kyiv School of Economics, this shadow fleet generated about $9.4 billion in additional revenue for Russia in 2024 alone by helping Moscow circumvent the $60 per barrel price cap imposed by Western nations. On average, Russian exporters have been getting around $65 per barrel for their crude, well above the cap. The environmental risks are also staggering. These are aging, poorly maintained vessels with questionable safety standards. In December 2024, 2 50-year-old tankers spilled up to 5,000 tons of oil in the Kerch Strait during a storm. Russian scientists called it the country's worst environmental catastrophe of the 21st century. With hundreds of these aging tankers crisscrossing the world's oceans, the risk of a major spill is constant. Major shipping companies typically dispose of tankers after about 15 years. After 25 years, they're usually scrapped. But shadow fleet tankers aren't being scrapped. They're being run into the ground because they're too valuable as sanctions-busting tools. Now, let's talk about what President Trump is really after here, because this seizure is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. On Tuesday, January 7th, the day before the Marinera was seized, Trump made a stunning announcement. He said Venezuela would be turning over between 30 million and 50 million barrels of sanctioned oil to the United States. He posted on Truth Social that this oil, which is currently sitting in storage because of the American embargo on Venezuelan exports, would be sold at market price. And here's the kicker. Trump said the money would be controlled by me, as President of the United States of America, to ensure it's used to benefit the people of Venezuela and the United States. At current market prices, we're talking about oil worth approximately $2 billion. How exactly is this going to work? Trump said he's directed Energy Secretary Chris Wright to execute the plan immediately. The oil will be loaded onto storage ships and brought directly to unloading docks in the United States. But here's what makes this so complicated. This is sanctioned oil. Venezuela couldn't sell it because of American sanctions. Most of it would have gone to China, which has been Venezuela's biggest oil customer. Now Trump is essentially seizing that same sanctioned oil and bringing it to America. The logic is almost circular. Washington imposed sanctions that destroyed Venezuela's oil industry. Then US military forces captured Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro over the weekend of January 4th. Now Trump is taking over the sanctioned oil that couldn't be sold because of those same sanctions. Venezuela's acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, is caught in an impossible position. On Tuesday, she pushed back, saying no external power was running Venezuela. She said her destiny was decided by God, not by American threats. But she can't be too defiant, or she risks another US military operation. China, meanwhile, is furious. Beijing's foreign ministry called the seizures a typical act of bullying and a serious violation of international law, and they have a point. China was buying most of that Venezuelan oil. Now it's going to America instead. This adds yet another layer of tension to US-China relations, which were already strained. On Friday, January 10th, Trump is meeting with executives from Chevron, ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil, and other major US oil companies at the White House to discuss Venezuela's oil sector. Chevron is currently the only American company still operating in Venezuela. Trump has made it clear he wants American firms to invest billions in fixing Venezuela's broken oil infrastructure and to take control of the country's vast oil reserves. Venezuela holds more than 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, nearly 4 times those of the United States. But mismanagement and corruption have caused production to collapse from about 3.5 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to roughly 800,000 barrels per day today, according to energy analytics firm Kepler. So, what does all this mean for the shadow fleet and for global politics? First, Trump has made it abundantly clear that the United States is going after these vessels aggressively. Since mid-December, 4 sanctioned oil tankers have been seized: the Skipper, the Centuries, the Marinera, and the Sophia. More seizures are almost certainly coming. In January 2025, just weeks before this operation, the US Treasury Department announced sanctions against 183 vessels as part of what they called an unprecedented crackdown on the shadow fleet. The Treasury said Russia has grown increasingly reliant on these vessels to facilitate illicit or sanctionable activity. Second, this is testing the limits of international maritime law. Russia claims the Marinera was a legitimate Russian vessel at the time of seizure, which would make the operation a violation of sovereignty. The United States argues the ship was stateless when initially pursued and only claimed Russian registry as a fraudulent attempt to avoid capture. Maritime law experts are divided, but one thing is certain. If countries start seizing each other's commercial vessels based on sanctions disputes, every tanker becomes a potential flashpoint. Third, the economic implications are massive. These shadow fleet operations aren't just about moving oil. They're about maintaining revenue streams that fund entire governments and military operations. For Russia, the shadow fleet is keeping the Kremlin's war machine running despite Western sanctions. For Iran, it's a lifeline that allows the regime to fund its military and weapons programs despite maximum pressure campaigns. For Venezuela, it's the difference between economic survival and complete collapse. Windward, a maritime intelligence company, reports that as of Q3 2025, more than 1,900 vessels are operating as part of the dark fleet. About 64% of these vessels are now sanctioned by at least one regulator, rising to 71% among large crude oil tankers over 80,000 deadweight tons. Yet the beneficial ownership of roughly 60% of these vessels remains unknown, creating persistent attribution gaps that delay enforcement. The Marinera seizure is significant because it shows Washington is willing to risk confrontation with Moscow to enforce these sanctions. Russian submarines may have been in the area. Russian naval assets were reportedly tracking the tanker. But US forces went ahead with the operation anyway. This is a level of assertiveness that raises questions about future incidents. What happens the next time a Russian-flagged Shadow Fleet tanker is tracked? What if Russia actually positions a submarine close enough to interfere? The United States just demonstrated it won't back down, even when Russian military assets are present. For global shipping, this creates a new level of uncertainty. Every tanker carrying sanctioned oil is now potentially vulnerable to seizure in international waters. Insurance costs for these operations are skyrocketing. Port authorities are becoming more cautious. Even legitimate shipping companies are worried about being caught in the crossfire. The International Maritime Organization adopted a resolution in December 2023 calling on member states to counter the illicit operations of the Russian Shadow Fleet, but implementation has been inconsistent. Meanwhile, the ships keep sailing. Russian oil exports via the Shadow Fleet reached 4.1 million barrels per day in June 2024, accounting for 70% of Russian seaborne oil and 89% of crude oil exports. The bigger story here isn't just about one tanker or even one country. It's about how the rules of global commerce are being rewritten in real time. Sanctions that were supposed to cripple adversaries have instead created parallel systems. The Shadow Fleet is now so large it represents nearly 1/5 of the global tanker capacity. These vessels operate in a grey zone between legal commerce and outright smuggling, exploiting loopholes in international law and taking advantage of jurisdictions with lax oversight. And they're not going away anytime soon. As long as there are sanctioned countries with oil to sell and buyers willing to take it, there will be ships willing to transport it. What makes the Bella 1 case particularly striking is how it encapsulates all these tensions in one dramatic package. You have an aging tanker with a murky ownership structure. You have Russia trying to protect it with naval assets. You have the United States conducting a military operation in international waters. You have China losing access to Venezuelan oil it was counting on. And you have Trump personally taking control of billions of dollars worth of sanctioned petroleum. It's a perfect storm of geopolitical competition, resource control, and military brinkmanship all rolled into one incident. The Marinera is now in US custody. Its crew will be brought to the United States for questioning and possible prosecution, according to the White House. The ship itself will likely be scrapped or sold. But the precedent has been set. The Shadow Fleet is no longer operating in the shadows. It's now the target of aggressive enforcement actions by the world's most powerful navy. And every other vessel in that fleet just got a very clear message. You can run, but you can't hide. The oceans may be vast, but American surveillance is everywhere, and when they decide to take a ship, they will take it, regardless of what flag it's flying or which submarine might be lurking nearby. That's the real story of the Marinera. It's not just about one tanker, it's about power, control, and the new rules of engagement in the global competition for resources. And if this week is any indication, things are about to get a lot more intense on the high seas.